Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 13 of Experience AV. I am Jim Maltese, one of the hosts. With me, as ever, is Jeremy Elsesser. And for the first time in our storied history of Experience AV, we have a guest. But not only a guest, my friends, it is the one, the only, the legendary, the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Fred Loucks. Oh man, let's try that again. The man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Fred Loucks. How you doing, dude?
Wow, you really oversold me.
Yes.
No, I'm doing good, man. Thanks for
Good.
having me on. Excited to get into it with you guys and enjoy a little intense conversation.
Love it.
I'm a little hyped up. It's been a long day.
It's good.
That's why we
Good.
like to do these right at the end of the day, man, when you're at your highest energy peak and totally worn out from the day.
Yeah.
Fred, so excited to have you here, man. Like Jim said, first ever guest for Experience AV. We are exploring new territory. Let our audio sound good and our video be stable for those who've been listening in for quite some time. How are you guys? How's things? How's life? How's your state? Where are you hailing from, Fred?
Yes. So joining from the Boise, Idaho metro area, and enjoying some lovely spring weather for our brief little window that is spring in Idaho, while it decides whether or not it wants to be winter or summer.
What's spring in Idaho look like? What's the temperature right now?
It's like high in the 60s, low in the 40s. It's kind of like perfect, exactly what I like. But
Perfect
like I said,
weather.
a little like a little schizophrenic. So it'll flip back and forth between snow and then like 100 degrees. So, Idaho. Just wait 10 minutes.
Yeah.
That sounds amazing. That sounds like winter weather for Arizona. Your spring weather is our winter. We're quickly approaching triple digits here, enjoying 90-degree weather and yeah, spring lasts for about a minute and a half, and then we just go right into summer pretty quickly. We have a fitful May, but man, that sounds really nice. How about you, Jim?
I'm doing good. Yeah, New York is not quite as snowy, but there is I love being outside on this time because like at night it's still cold. If you're going camping, like you just get that good sleep on, right? Your nose gets a little cold, but you're nice and warm in the sleeping bag. And then during the day, you got shorts and a t-shirt. It's perfect. It's great. I love it. And you're not sweating just sitting down. It's I love that weather.
Wow. Yeah, sweating, sitting down. On that note, did everybody get the memo that you were supposed to show up today with your preferred beverage of choice?
Yes.
No memo.
Yes. No memo needed.
Cheers. Cheers. Cheers to you. All right, Jim, why don't you kick us off? Like, what are we talking about with the esteemed Mr. Loucks?
Well, and first, so we sometimes do have some listeners. They sometimes comment, so we'll hopefully get some interaction there. But today we are going to be talking about why is monitoring AV so dang hard? So monitoring is hard, monitoring AV is even harder, but why and what can we do to fix it? And that's why Fred is here. I mean, if there are a lot of people who can say a lot of things, but Fred has been neck deep in this stuff for quite some time. So it's a really good conversation to have.
And before we release Fred to answer that very important question, I think it's interesting because, a few episodes ago, we had an episode about proactive maintenance is dead, long live AV monitoring, right? So we all, when I say all, me and you, the two of us, agreed that the future of AV in our industry is proactive monitoring and all the value that comes with proactive monitoring. And I'll be really interested to get Fred's take on if he agrees with that being the future of our industry. But then this question, I think, just frames it all up so nicely. Okay, if that is the future of our industry, why isn't it here yet?
That's right. And you know, just to round that out, right? Like because we were struggling with the question, like, can RMM replace preventive maintenance visit? Can replace boots on the ground? And that was kind of our takeaway was, for the cookie cutter systems, for the standardized systems, for the really streamlined systems, it probably can do a really great job of keeping it up and running, letting people know when there's an issue, maybe even fixing the issues with some form of automation or remote support. But for those mission critical, big honking, complex system, we can't get away from having boots on the ground and having someone go in there and push some buttons and connect some cables.
Big honking, man. That's
Big
quite
honking.
the that's
That's a
quite the
yeah.
technical metric
Yeah,
of
yeah,
measurement.
yeah.
Well, Fred, as you can see, you know, we like to have a little bit of fun here, but man, let's hear from you. You're the guy that spent more time than anybody I know trying to answer this question and bring solutions. Why is monitoring AV so damn hard?
Wow. Yeah, so I have more questions than I have answers here, but I'll try. So I guess the first piece that I would say is we first have to get on the same page about what we mean by monitoring, because that's problem number one. So if you're like thinking, you know, ping monitoring is enough, right? If that's the definition of what monitoring means for the use case at hand, then you got a lot of tools that are going to work really good for you, and you can go off on your merry way and have fun. This conversation is not for you, but the problem is when you have to go further than that. And I would argue that's all the time. Like, ping monitoring is never enough to actually capture the experience the user may be having in a space. That's really at the end of the deal. So why do we monitor? Like, what's the point of monitoring, right? Like, maybe let's get into that. Let's start with why here, and let's get into what the why of monitoring and what that is. If I were to throw my own starting point out there, and I'd love to hear from you guys, but we monitor because most of the time our users know what's wrong before we do, or at least that something is wrong, industry-wide. I'll step on my own foot here, but I would say that's the assumption I walk into this with, is that most of the time, this is coming from years of experience in enterprises and large audiovisual systems and global networks and all that fun stuff, most of the time our users know something is wrong way before we do, as managers or as integrators in particular. And so everything is reactive. Everything in the AV industry is reactive break fix, and that is horrendous. That is horrible. Can you imagine if Google was waiting around for you to report that the search engine page didn't work?
They're not waiting. I'm sorry. Bad joke. Good point.
Like, seriously, can you imagine? Or your carrier class networks or any of this stuff? Like, this is, it's almost ridiculous to hear the term like monitoring is the future. It's like, no, duh, right? Monitoring was like 20 years ago. Monitoring was the future. Like, monitoring is way, way overdue, like terrifyingly, horrendously overdue for the AV industry. And the industry hasn't brought anything valuable to the table here, in my opinion, at all. So like, we're kind of stuck to figure it out as integrators. Yeah, shots fired. So
I was just going to say, man,
any response to any of that?
Tons of response. Go, Jim. You go first.
Yeah. All right. So let's take. So ping monitoring, completely agreed that it is not enough. But let's say that's the only thing we have. That's the only thing we can afford to get out there. And let's say the spectrum is 0 being the users calling up and I'm going to fire you. I'm going to pull all your systems out of my building. This is ridiculous. And at the other end of the spectrum is having a monitoring system that can diagnose the problem and maybe even fix it without anyone being the wiser. What percentage does just ping monitoring get you? Because I would argue that gets you like 40% there. If a box stops responding, you should cycle power or call someone to the room. Like I think that's pretty significant.
Man, you want to talk about challenging this conversation, right? Like, you're now assuming that the AV system requires the network connection to provide the function that it's providing to the customer. So are we just talking about video conferencing platforms? What about systems that they lose a network connection, but I can still plug my HDMI in and get audio and video to route? So at the end of the day,
fair.
right. And I think that's to the point, right? It's complex. What we do in AV is complex, and there's so many features that are required there, like ping monitoring. Yeah, that's like layer one, lovingly layer one testing. Okay, the connection is plugged into the box, but there's so many other things that we need to get from that device, from that system, from that platform to know if it's actually providing the outcome. So, Fred, you hit on it for me right at the beginning, which is, let's ask why do we want to monitor things? And I think, simply put, for me, it's to move from reactive to proactive. And like you said, my background is IT. I've been in network engineering and carrier class network for a long time. We've been monitoring stuff for 20 years. So I, like you, am like, it's laughable that we're having this conversation from an AV perspective, because the platforms exist out there. Manufacturers have gotten on board with this whole concept all the way around. So again, when you come back to the outcome, manufacturers of IT products, I should be more.
Thank you. Okay.
All right. That's fair. That's fair.
A little bit different.
I'm sorry. I'm very much speaking to the revolution or evolution that the IT world went through, and the standardization that happened at the manufacturer level that enabled a lot of today's managed service providers and monitoring platforms to be able to get the kind of rich data that you want from those devices to really put yourself in a proactive state. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. It comes back to the why, right? How can you identify a problem more than just ping is down, and solve that before it affects a user, right? So that, to me, is the answer of why. Why is monitoring important? It's going from a reactive state to a proactive state. And Fred, you have more experience than any of us from a global perspective. What if that device or system is in another country, right? Like, you don't have the benefit of being able to walk over there and see if the thing is working. So, yeah.
All right, so let's paint a picture. Let's say we are technology managers. We've got huge custom MPR rooms, which are all crazy, $1 million plus whatever. But we've got hundreds of these huddle rooms, and they have a network display, some type of codec appliance, and like a simple mixer, like something that takes a few ceiling mics, converts it to USB to feed the conferencing endpoint. Hundreds of those. And those are like that's the picture that I'd at least like to start the conversation on. So what type of information could we get? What type of information should we be monitoring on those systems?
Yeah, that's it's a good place to get in, because I think it answers your initial response, Jim. Because, well, so ping is great. That's the starting point. It's cute. It works. So the problem is that ping doesn't tell you anything other than no one's home.
Right.
It doesn't tell you if the stack has crashed. It doesn't tell you if power's been removed. It doesn't tell you anything. And more importantly, it doesn't. Sometimes it's a red herring. Sometimes there's nothing wrong. So we have users who restart or shut down computers in one of our market segments, right? We have users that shut down computers when they're not in use, and they turn them on. If you're monitoring ping on those systems or whatever, right, that looks like an alert. If you're monitoring anything, by the way, on those systems, it looks like an alert. But you have to, take the point for what it is. Like, sometimes, ping does not necessarily indicate a problem, right? But let's let's go further than that. So like, what would you want to monitor? Ping won't tell you if the backlight on a display is out or if it's on the wrong input, right? Like, let's just bare bones thing, right? Like the bare minimum is the TV on. Ping doesn't tell you, right? Ping, unless you've got some screwed up network stack like some of the lovely display manufacturers we worked with, and you turn it off and the stack turns off, or blips out for 10 seconds. So I would say, like ping is better than nothing. Sure, a feather in a bowling ball, and a vacuum land on the ground at the same time, but that's not reality, right? And the reality isn't that like, ping has significant value. The reality is the bare minimum you should ever be doing is ping, and you should probably be embarrassed. Like seriously, like I have this fear, this imposter syndrome fear that like I think if we were to poll IT directors or CIOs or CTOs or any of those kind of like technical leadership roles, that they would all be flabbergasted by the concept that there's not monitoring in conference rooms by now. Like that's not a thing, because it isn't. And don't get me going on Fusion or that's
well, so yeah, actually, I have to stop you right there.
Yeah, go for it.
And go back to the shot fired across the bow. And we actually have some participation from Chris Montfort on our Facebook Live page, and he brought up some points. Right, don't forget about telemetry. Devices need to talk to each other, right? Not just ping, but a device talking to another device. How are you measuring that? And it goes further, right? You need data to make data-driven decisions, usage metrics, uptime, downtime, starting to paint the picture of the other types of metrics. And then the third comment, which is what'll wrap this all up, Crestron Fusion was a great starting point for all of this back in the day. So Fred, you made a pretty strong statement that our industry has done, if I correctly captured it, nothing. They have brought nothing to the table to help try to solve this problem. Fusion, right? The vision for Fusion was to provide a monitoring system, first of its kind, evolving into XIO Cloud. There's these other types of tools. You've got, Logi has a platform. You've got Poly with a platform. Everybody's got a platform to manage their devices. So is it fair to say that our industry has done nothing to help with the answer to the question? And how do you feel about Fusion, Fred? How do you feel about Fusion?
Well, I feel the same as probably most people who've ever worked with Fusion feel. So here's what I'd say. Maybe nothing is a bit strong, but when Fusion came out, the IT industry already had 14 different network monitoring tools that worked with a standardized interface on any component. And so Fusion, like it's great, but it only works if you have a Crestron processor in the room or a Crestron connected driver in the device. And that's a small world. And frankly, the whole problem, like Crestron did an interesting job of approaching it because their whole world is control system. So let's take a control system centric approach because we already have all these drivers that talk to all these different makes and models. So I understand why the approach is taken, but the approach is not relevant anymore. It is not relevant because your Zoom rooms and your Teams rooms don't have control system programming. They don't need control system programming.
Yep.
We don't want control system programming for those spaces 99% of the time because it's just too much expense. It's too much complexity and it just doesn't matter. So in those small systems, right? We're talking the ones these like the 90% of rooms you're deploying throughout a large enterprise, right? Standard system types. You don't want to introduce control system programming into that mix as a way to get monitoring, right? So I guess I just take issue with the whole approach. So, valiant effort for working with the industry as it sits, but we were 10, 15 years behind the day we started trying to make a centralized view of AV infrastructure. So, that's my opinion on it. And all these different tools, right? Whatever you might have. Sorry, really quick, Jim. All these different tools, right? They only solve a problem relevant to them.
You're saying manufacturer specific, right?
The point
to
tools, right? You got all these different point tools made by various manufacturers, and they only are relevant to the manufacturer at hand, which is cool for the manufacturer because their whole world is their product. But for the systems integrators and the end AV managers, it's a flippin' nightmare to try and manage all this stuff. Go ahead, Jim.
And there's so much precedent there in the AV history where instead of taking that global view or that scalable view or that like open source view, which is, you know, very common in the IT space, AV manufacturers always go for their special sauce, you know, because they think it's unique and it's going to be the best and this is going to drive people to use our products, but they end up shooting themselves in the foot, and it happens time and again, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost akin to the interoperability conversation between platforms, right? Like, why wouldn't you want your Zoom meeting to talk to a Teams meeting? Like, why wouldn't you want? Isn't that what the people want?
Yep.
I mean, I think we've made it as far as we've made it because the people have demanded that. So it's an interesting thought, kind of looking at it from a monitoring perspective. You know, it's Fred, just to hit on the point you made about Fusion, and Chris again contributing here on Facebook. He agreed, right? Took too long to set up, wasn't intuitive, and you were at the mercy of the Crestron programmer, which I think really highlights your point. Like, it was a very siloed, proprietary approach that, I mean, could you even monitor things out? Yeah, it cost a lot of money, cost a lot of setup time, and there was nothing standardized about it, right? To the point, right? A code that worked for one system didn't necessarily have the necessary hooks in it for another system to be able to provide that kind of rich data back and forth. So it was a task to try to get it. And I personally have never even seen a Fusion system set up that I was like, okay, wow, yeah, like this is it. This is where I feel like you can move to that proactive state and use data to drive decisions.
Yeah. But and not, you know, we've been poo-pooing on manufacturers for a bit, but in their defense, if you are relegated to a standard, right, like an international standard, business standard, whatever, you're almost constrained. And it's always been the case, even on standards-based video conferencing, where you know, when a Polycom talked to a Tandberg, it worked. You were able to handshake, you would get it. But when a Polycom talked to a Polycom,
assuming
now
all
you
the
get all
firewall
these
was set
extra
up right.
features. Yeah, well, yeah. But they're able to innovate and they're able to differentiate. And I, you know, I feel like that's the trouble with kind of doing what we do, where everyone is always looking for the human experience instead of just a system experience. Like, you know, IT is engineered systems. It's you have a definitive goal, whereas in AV, the goals are changing, the spaces are changing, and so to get a little bit of an extra better experience by going around a standard, you know, I think that's why they're doing it.
I think it's a money-driven conversation.
So I thought that was very, very optimistic of Jim to take the approach of they're doing it to make the experience better. But like, I think from the benefit of a sales perspective, like,
for sure,
right? I think that the point is you release better features so people buy your stuff, right?
Yeah.
And there's a protectionism within the AV industry and within the manufacturing space, of course, because this is a cutthroat, you know, market. And the second you release anything innovative, you're gonna have three other manufacturers that have got the same thing right within a year, right? You have about that long, maybe a year of runway before there's another box that does the exact same thing.
Yeah.
But I would argue that that doesn't mean you can't use a standardized or interoperable approach. And we're a bit off of monitoring at the moment, but like let's you know, we're here, so let's go down that path. Like, sure. SIP and H323, right? There was a limited capability for the finer points, the special features, right? But where was the industry committee? Where was the, you know, the IEEE, right? Of where was the contribution and the lobbying on the manufacturer side to say, well, let's make it better? we'll just make our own. Right? We'll just make our own because we can sell it as our secret sauce. And not to say I'm not poo-pooing, like it's hard to do, right? It's hard to build standards. It's hard to move standards forward. They move slower, and maybe that's not going to move your business forward right now. I get it.
Yeah.
But I think it's different in monitoring because I don't think there's an experiential element here.
100% right. Bringing it back to topic, baby. You're right. You're 100%. And that's just it, right? Because in monitoring, we're getting, I mean, there's an element of experience, but at least now we almost can take the humans out of it because we're just talking machine to machine.
Whoa. So yeah, sure, you can take the humans out of it, but that's the problem. The AV manufacturers, and forgive me for anyone who's listening because I'm being very generic, throwing a label on all AV manufacturers. There are levels of gray in here, certainly. Some that have done much better job than others. But if you allow me to paint with a broad brush, right, and use some broad strokes. I don't know, I guess I would just say that 99% of AV systems are not meant to be managed by machines. They're not meant to be monitored by machines. They weren't built with that in mind. Generally speaking, that's been the status quo. They've been meant to be interacted with by a human behind a piece of software or a web interface. I'd take, ceiling mic A, B, C, or D, right? Like, or any, gosh, almost, especially audio products. Not to pick on them, more than others, but think about from a configuration management perspective, right? It is all human driven. I can't think of one, again, I'm gonna throw myself out there and I'm looking for comments from the chat, but I can't think of a single product in the AV industry that is declarative, idempotent configuration based. By that, I mean, you define some text document, some YAML, some JSON that says behave in such way, and you give it to the device, and the device figures out how to make itself do all of the things it needs to do. Versus, I got to go into the console, and this one happens to be Telnet, or this one happens to be 7124 with a hex encoding, or whatever it might be. Or I'm going to go to the web GUI, and I got to go clickety click, and do all this stuff. It's all stateful, which is, if you think about all of the entire, if you're familiar at all with like software and cloud and the way things work right now, it's the opposite. Everything is declarative. Everything is stateless wherever we possibly can. So why have we not done that? And I just have to believe that that's maybe, if I'm giving some leash, that's kind of our fault. From the systems integration in the end user space, not making a mess about this, not making a ruckus, not pushing back and saying, no, I need SNMP on every box. It's absurd that I can't just use standard SNMP on every box. And if you need a console, use SSH, not a weird version of SSH.
Right.
Like real, normal, open SSH. Like those kinds of things for configuration management. These are just standards. They just work. They don't need to be reinvented, and they bring no strategic value. So that's where I go with it. It's like, sure, I get it in product, like customer-facing, end-user-facing differentiation, but this stuff is like, can you imagine if, and this is for Jeremy, can you imagine working back in carrier class networks if you were choosing between the various network switches and you were evaluating switch A, which you really liked, but it doesn't support SNMP. It uses SNM6, like that would not happen.
Nope.
So
and it comes back to the community involvement that you mentioned before, right? There was a big fight from the IT and network side to force manufacturers to bring, look, you can have your special sauce and you can have your features, but you're also going to have this totally standardized interface that's going to allow us to get the information that we need. Like, I'm sorry, but mixed vendor environments, you can't hold, and I'm going to say the word, it feels like being held hostage. And to your point, using multiple tools to get sense of what's happening in your environment is just not efficient, which kind of brings me to another point. But there's a couple of comments coming in here on the chat that you asked for here, Fred, which was Mr. Justin Watts has joined us. Hey, Justin, looking forward to
Mr. Justin Watts.
Fantastic.
Is that a power joke? It's always a power joke with that guy.
No,
I swear.
No, we just got the heavy hitters in the listeners.
It's always a power joke.
Chris and Justin are monsters. It's great.
So he mentioned to date, there has not been an off-the-shelf solution to provide us metrology that's meaningful outside vendor X's ecosystem, which I think, again, kind of supports the conversation that we're having. Another comment, monitoring should build a more efficient manner in which humans interact with technology.
Yes.
And then lastly, TMS from Cisco was supposed to be this with advanced provisioning, but it just handled the codec side. And then quickly getting into security issues, right? SSH could be a security issue, becomes an issue, big holes in security hardening profiles. So getting support from our listeners that, yeah, like there's some point tools that do some things, but I think that comes back to a question, if I can just hit it on from an IT perspective, right? There is a ton of IT management tools out there that you can bring all kinds of mixed vendor environments. Bring your own server OS, as long as it's a widely distributed, available GA server OS, we can monitor it and get rich data from it. Bring whatever switch you want, bring whatever router you want. And guess what I get? I get a single pane of glass that's telling me what's happening across all of those manufacturers. Does that exist?
Why does that exist in IT? But like CEC to me would have been the perfect opportunity for AV to hop on it. And
you do know what the first C stands for in CEC, right?
Yes.
All right, just throwing it out there.
But consumer, but like that was the opportunity, and it's a disaster. Like what happens? And that was an attempt at some type of standardization, right, across manufacturers, and it's a nightmare. Like I don't understand how that happens.
You said it at the beginning. Because everybody's got to have their own little special secret sauce.
I guess.
Everyone's got to do it a little bit differently. And again, I don't mean to totally put that blame on the manufacturers, but
we're accepting it.
Where's the consortium, right? Like that's working on this stuff within, for AV protocols, or where's the involvement in the IEEE or other, like where's where are we at? And because there's a lot of different standards organizations, serving within the AV industry, and several are working on various products, but you notice it always ends up the same way. AVB is a great example. Like, we're AVB, we're standard, right? But everybody's got a different flavor of AVB. Everybody's got a little different thing going on here. Not staying in the lane. Jeremy, I wanted to directly respond to the question you asked, which is, does that exist, right? Like, where's that single point pane of glass tool? And I'll tell you what, here's where in my heart of hearts I have landed. There's a little bit of preview here of my shameless plug, my upcoming chat at InfoComm on Thursday morning at InfoComm, talking about monitoring and single pane of glass. I'll give you my preview, and that is, don't use AV tools. That's the short version. You want monitoring, you want observability, you want a single pane of glass, don't look in the AV industry. Okay. I'm going to wait for all the comments to come in. But
dot. Yeah.
Okay. Instead, look at the enormous market space for IT observability and IT network monitoring. And you might say, oh, but they don't know how to talk to, I don't know, X, Y, or Z, my displays or my processors or whatever else. This is the hard truth. Okay. No, they're not going to have it in their marketplace. No, they're not going to have your XYZ display or your XYZ processor or your XYZ switcher in their marketplace of supported products. Absolutely not. You need to become or hire at least light developer. You need to learn to script. That's the only way. That's the only method to success in today's industry. And it is not for the faint of heart, mind you. It is extremely difficult. But it can be done, especially with some constraints. It's really hard as a systems integrator. It's a lot easier with an enterprise. Because you can do this. You can take pretty much any network monitoring tool off the shelf, and you can build the scripting you need to get telemetry data from your audiovisual devices into that tool. But you have to be prepared to work for it. You got to be prepared to work for it. The work for it is, you got to write the scripts. You got to become familiar with Bash and PowerShell and Python and Groovy and Docker, very important, or other container. You have to get your head around the fact you're going to have to write code to do this, and it's middleware essentially. You're going to train these systems how to talk to AV devices through the available interfaces, and sometimes you'll luck out because they'll have an SSH interface, and you can do some GUI based. I'm going to quickly click and put a step in here, and cool, I can get the version for my processor as a metric. Awesome, right? But I would say without spending a dime on AV network monitoring tools, you can take open source IT tools for a few $100 a month for hosting costs and stand up network monitoring for your audiovisual devices. The only thing you can pay for is the time and energy it takes to learn some scripting and Git and the other pieces that a modern technology professional should know, or hire somebody who does. It can be done.
I love that only because, well, for a lot of reasons, but this is where integration, like this has the roots of AV integration in it. It might be counterintuitive because it's not based on hardware, but that's been our job since the get, is getting things from different manufacturers to play nicely together. And the number of boxes has been reduced. The I guess the amount of interconnected devices has been reduced in typical AV systems, but the software aspect of it and this monitoring aspect of it, that's the next, like, open waters for AV integration. If we can get this under our belts and figure out how to make this device talk to this device regardless of manufacturer, I think this is the perfect place for AV integrators to be. I'm excited about it. I love that.
This is the software defined everything moment for the
Yeah.
AV industry. Okay. And the reason it's interesting, my position is on this has changed a bit, but I don't, IT in some ways, I've made the comment before that IT is eating the AV industry, absorbing the AV industry. And I think that's very true in a lot of enterprises. I think it's very true within MSPs, buying up integrators so they can perform IT services or AV services. Certainly every enterprise I've worked for, I've been in the IT department, working on AV. That wasn't like some separate thing. It's a part of the IT function, especially now with work. There's no dividing it within corporate communication, not within production or broadcast, recording, or anything, like different thing, corporate communication. But I guess I would just say that really more than IT, it's software. Software is what's eating the AV industry and will eat the AV industry whole. And it's such an opportunity. It's such an opportunity. There is money to be made. There are lives to be made better. There is a great experience to be had, changing our paradigm. And man, just in time, because hey, have you heard of the supply chain lately? Like, we have needed this for so long. And so there's a great opportunity with software, with cloud, with containers, with Kubernetes. There are incredible opportunities to get down this path. And security is going to be fundamental. We'll put a pin in that because I'm sure we're going to talk about cloud and software. But I wanted to just note, I heard the comment around security and SSH and the other interfaces. I completely agree. You got to start somewhere. So maybe let's start with the standard protocols. And then let's work on like zero trust protocols. Let's work on zero trust network overlays. Like, let's work on getting it better for our end enterprise customers and such. But like, can we just start with SSH?
Is that part of the problem though? Are client networks and cybersecurity folks so nervous about that they're not going to accept any baby steps, and you've got to come correct with this like really robust offering that zero trust and all this before you even take those baby steps? Is that what's preventing people?
No. I would say every AV device deployed on a corporate network is a compromise right now. They're just like, so if you research IoT security, you get into this. AV devices, as I'm on the record saying, are like bad IoT. Right? It's IoT without any standard protocols associated with it, like MQTT or AMQP or any of the more standard solutions. And they are, you have hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of endpoints on customer networks right now that have IoT connections out to cloud platforms that you don't know Those are there whether you want them to be there or not, unless you're explicitly blocking outbound web traffic, which you're probably not. And you never know if one of these services, right, forgets to renew a certificate and they get, intercepted, and some malware firmware gets pushed down to a device, and now that's an entry point and it can move east and west across your network. And before you know it, any one of these AV manufacturers could be the next, Casilla or whatever broad systemic attack that surfaces through. Now, I'm not to put all the risk on them, but there is a significant chance that these IoT devices are going to pose a security problem. And I would say most security professionals don't maybe even know that they're there, or if they do, are limited by just reality of what we can do to prevent it. So there's some good strategies out there from a security perspective. There's a lot we can do, but I don't think that's gating us from like standardized interfaces, right? I would rather see SSH with an SSH key, configured, or a couple of SSH keys configured, than to see, telnet or, another TCP socket on some random port or whatever might have for administration,
Right.
You're getting some great support from the chat. Justin says, say it louder for the folks in the back, right? Like you're preaching the good word here, Fred. And if I can take a minute here and just kind of re-summarize what we've talked through in trying to answer this question, right? Why do you want to monitor? Why is it challenging? What tools exist? It sounds like the tools exist today. And not only the tools exist today, but the protocols exist. The solutions to be implemented on these IoT devices, it's not that they don't exist out there. It's just that they're not being implemented on the IoT devices that we're finding in the AV industry. Right. Is that a fair statement?
I would say largely that there are, let's just take monitoring specifically, right? There are lots of really good open source protocols, standard protocols for monitoring. Lots and lots and lots of them. Let's not even talk about configuration management right now. Let's just do monitoring. SNMP alone works, especially for discovery. It's a great way to start. Let's just start there.
Publish all the known data about your device and make it really easy to get without scripting anything. Just connect it.
Yeah, and I will say, like right out of the gate, this is all fundamentally based on a trust boundary. So we're not into zero trust. We're not having a zero trust conversation yet, because the corporate network represents a trust boundary here. And we're making the assumption that you don't have bad actors on the LAN, on the WAN, scanning SNMP, trying to get data from endpoints. You can certainly use SNMP v3. You can put authentication in front of it. You can change your community strings and do all kinds of things to help prevent that kind of thing. But I don't think these protocols are, unless you have authentication. I don't know if any of them are even encrypted. So it's not like, those are not internet safe protocols, okay? They still rely on a trust boundary. And that's IoT and AV networking in general. Best practice, okay? You want all of your AV traffic segmented on an AV VLAN, ideally a non-routed VLAN outside of default gateway to the internet, because we do not want any east-west capability on these systems. But putting that as an assumption that we're not talking zero trust, and yes, SNMP has its problems, it's better than what we have, right? It's at least a standard. It opens up the entire IT monitoring platform. Every IT monitoring solution, every one of them supports SNMP. There's now 50 tools out there you can use to get your data. And it's not going to get you everything. We can get into more of like, what are you not getting, right? Cloud platforms, Teams, Zooms, information, room calendars, right? There's lots of other stuff we need, but at least to get device data, that should be, the first thing. The only other piece I'd add to that is polling is really kind of a terrible way to monitor an IoT. And most IoT products, if not all IoT products, do not poll for data. We're not having some collector sitting there polling the device and saying, now tell me what you feel. Now tell me what you feel. That's not a good way to do it. And it opens those ports up to be scanned by anybody, right? So no, the way to get the future, the far off future, is push metrics. it has to be push metrics, right? Just the way that applications do it too for APM, application performance monitoring. In the cloud, we don't want to go try to ask all of our containers or all of our servers or all of our whatever what they're doing, because they're elastic, they're dynamic. They spin up, they spin down, they change IPs, they move around. You can't keep track of it. It's not static inventory. So instead of, yes, enable SNMP for God's sake, because at least the IT monitoring team at Enterprise XYZ can start getting data from those devices, so they can know the firmware version, so they can know if they have a critical, like a CVE that's critical, that's a problem for their organization, so they can know they need to update firmware, etc. Yes, do that. But the inevitable here is pick an open standard for push metrics like OpenTelemetry, not shameless plug, but not affiliated with OpenTelemetry product, but an open source, incredible push metrics standard that just pushes everything out as key value pairs that a number of monitoring platforms can take, a number of APM platforms can take. And instead of saying, go ask a device, put in a URL for where to push that data. And oh, by the way, manufacturers, go ahead and secretly put your URL in too, and get all the data you want from these devices, because we know you are anyway. Go for it. But give us some URL lines where we can put our own servers in there and start saying, hey, push data here. That's the way you get there.
Interesting. Do you think there needs to be a change in the robustness of the AV devices? Like, do you think that there is a difference between, I guess, how the uptime of a networked appliance versus the uptime of an AV device to make that realistic?
I don't think it's a gate. Because if the device isn't pushing metrics, it's not online. So it's a good idea. There's an issue.
Yep.
So it's a good indication of a problem. And ideally, maybe you get both, right? You get some SNMP, some polling metrics, some ping, and some push metrics for the big detailed stuff, like what's the program doing right now, right? So I don't know that there needs to be a major shift there, although I don't think many would disagree with me in saying that AV systems are notoriously unreliable.
Yeah,
and it really comes down to programming, I think, most of the time, not to throw those guys under the bus, but a lot of times it seems like it's really just a matter of stability in the software deployed. But I would say at the end of the day, downtime costs companies money.
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to avoid, right? At the end of the day, yes, we can say it's about the user experience, and it's important because those are the people we serve at the end of the day, and the show's called Experience AV, so let's go with that. But at the end of the day, it's companies spending money trying to fix stuff, losing productivity, etc. And that's what we're ultimately trying to.
And reputation, right? Which is killer.
Yeah,
absolutely. What's involved with enabling SNMP? Is that just firmware? Is it additional hardware? Like how, if I'm a manufacturer and let's say, all right, I want to get on board, let's make this happen. Is it just software?
Yeah, it's part of your TCP stack. You just add it on the back end, it sits there and listens. So yeah, any hardware that's out there right now, that's just something you need to enable in the code base.
Doesn't seem right. That
I mean, I'll shoot across the bow with that. There is such stabilized code that you can go get to enable SNMP on your product. The fact that our manufacturers are not doing it is quite frankly disturbing and just kind of lazy at the end of the day. It's a light lift. Your product already has all this information in it. All you're doing is exposing it to be picked up by a monitoring tool that's well-defined and has been in place for 20 years. Like, it's an easy lift. And the fact that we don't have it, it kind of brings me to the bigger question here, which is why don't we have this?
Yeah.
What's it going to take to get there? Right. Then Fred, you hit, I think, a great point. And while in the short term, and maybe it's not just short term. So we'll argue about this for a moment, but in the short term, there's a huge opportunity for integrators, for software developers, for somebody to come and fill the gap that exists. There are tools out there that can monitor. They just don't talk the language of the devices. So you've got to develop that connectivity between the device and the monitoring platform. tons of opportunity for us to provide that type of a service or solution. That's not what we're doing in IT anymore. I don't write a driver to go talk to a Cisco switch and connect it to SolarWinds, right? That work has already been done. It's been standardized. In fact, Cisco counts on tools like that being able to talk to their devices and provide that type of rich data to providers. Is it never going to happen in our industry? I would like to think not. And so taking the optimist approach here, that it is going to be an inevitability, what's it gonna take to move the needle?
Well, and an early adopter, talk about a differentiator. Hey, I'm a big manufacturer, and I just enabled SNMP. Like, how many enterprise clients would jump on that? That's huge.
It's a
And to be
differentiator.
fair, if I were to take maybe the top 5, or so big AV manufacturers, SNMP is there, right? But it's not there all over the place. It's there on some products and not others, right? It's there. It's spotty. It doesn't actually have all the metrics or all the information, and nobody publishes the MIBs.
Yeah.
Like where
Because it's not. They're not serious about it.
No,
it's not.
Because it's exactly. I think it's a lot like we've got touch panels out there and stuff like that. That this can be TLS enabled, right? Drop your certificate on it. I'm like, man, I don't know a lot of industries, a lot of enterprises that are out there deploying full-on TLS SSL encryption on web interfaces on LAN devices for 1,000 touch panels, right, with an internal CA, because there's no automation to really help you with it. So it's not like deploying it on 3 servers. There's a lot of these features that are like enterprise features, right? SNMP and TLS and stuff like that. The industry's just got to get serious about that, and they'll reap the benefit, right? Because you don't have to maintain a code base for a console, right? Use SSH. It's fine. Right. It's good, right? Use OpenSSH. And you don't need to maintain a monitoring endpoint, right? Use SNMP. It's fine. It works. There's a lot of opportunity for this kind of stuff. And there's tons of applications out there that run the entire freaking universe, that run on REST APIs, that run on microservices, that run on pub subs like MQTT. There's a ton of protocols out there to choose from. We don't have to make them. So that's what I would say is that I think there's a lot out there that think they're checking the box, that I'm still having to go get the rest of the data. Like, I don't know. I'm not going to get into specifics because I don't want to call anybody out, but there's application layer information. Like, is my program running? Are all the things that are supposed to be connected to it, and currently reporting is online? Those things should be available through an SNMP. They should be behind an OID. It should be available through easy querying. Or if you don't want to do that, just do push metrics. It's like that would work great. So that's my take on it.
It still doesn't answer the question for me though, which is, how do we start to move the needle on the industry in our manufacturers for it to become important and to start moving towards, and it's interesting because this conversation has become hybrid in the respect of, it's monitoring that we're talking about, but it's part and parcel to security and hardening their devices and really making them enterprise network capable, right? We've had so many experiences of getting really excited about a product, but then you look at it from an enterprise network perspective and it falls down very, very quickly because it can't stand up to the rigorous protocols that, oh, by the way, are fully standardized and documented if you just went out and, got that information and implemented them into your products because you're serious about being respected within the industry as an enterprise IT product, because that's where we're going. Anyway, I digress there, but what's the answer? How do we move the needle? Is it a big attack? Is it a vulnerability that causes some major strife for a manufacturer that moves the needle on this? Is it a grassroots community effort? And maybe that's, a call to action for this podcast. Like, how do we get a group of people together to start lobbying to the manufacturers and making them, aware? Fred, give it to me.
3 things, in my opinion. 3 things that will move this. 1, there should be some call out within the industry around, some community, call to action, some drive towards a white paper or something along those lines, right? Something that says, hey, this is what we propose for the AV industry. This should be the standard 2 or 3 IT protocols you should adopt for everything, right? So some place to start. Like, don't make them figure it out on their own. Like, here's some guidance that we can get, maybe even ratified as a standard, right, or something like that. Like, hey, these are the standard protocols we want to work with, just like SPC or what have you. So one, two and three are both market pressure. Market pressure is going to drive this to occur. The more AV integrators that get absorbed into IT MSPs, the more large enterprises that get involved in this stuff, and they don't even have an IT team or an AV team. They've just, they've got IT professionals who are responsible for conference rooms, and they're spinning up appliances with displays. That is going to be which ones do I want to buy? These ones have SNMP and SSH and standard interfaces, and these ones use some proprietary desktop software that still relies on a broadcast. Which one am I going to pick? I'm supposed to put 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 displays out in an enterprise. What am I going to pick? I'm going to pick the stuff that makes my life easy. I'm going to pick the displays that allow firmware updates without the display needing to be manually rebooted. Like, I'm gonna pick the devices that have the APIs available and the endpoints available for monitoring within what I already have. Right? AV teams don't generally get to pick their monitoring tool in enterprises in particular. They get saddled with what they're given. What they're given is an IT tool, and it falls apart from there. So that's market pressure number one. Market pressure number two is software is going to eat their lunch. We're not even going to have to worry about it because control processes are going to go into commodity hardware. It's going to run on clouds and Kubernetes and in the edge and wherever else, and we're not even going to need to worry about it because we're just going to use native AWS monitoring, from these monitoring tools, or whatever other applications we're running. That's the other huge market pressure. And I think it's adapt or die, at the end of the day when it comes to this stuff.
I got to just share some comments that are coming in from the chat to kind of support this because, Mr. Montfort and Mr. Watts are both well experienced in large enterprise spaces, and they had some pretty strong opinions about what we're talking about right now, right? And going back a little bit, a comment from both Chris and Justin, right? Enterprise customers, they're already building their own solutions. They don't have the patience to wait anymore, right? The frustration, the patience has built up enough to cause them to develop their own solutions, and they're incredible, right? Like, they're doing really good things with driving that own solution and not waiting on the manufacturer. And then, when asking, how do we move the needle on this? It's customers that need to drive this conversation more than anything else. As much as we like to think that we have a part to play, and we do as integrators, right? But we've all worked in the enterprise space long enough that we know that the bigger bat is at the customer level, right? Yeah. The customer being able to drive the conversation and lobby for that is going to be what moves the needle on that. So I love that. Justin also says, I've always been asking point blank for anything that can make that security integration easier from an IEEE standpoint. Manufacturers just stare at me like I'm nuts. Like, man, I've been in this industry for going on, I think, 18 years now. And prior life was carrier class enterprise networks. And I started coming into meetings with manufacturers, and I'm like, so you guys support SNMP? And they're like, what? Yeah. Fast forward to 2022, and I'm still talking to AV manufacturer sales folks, and I asked the same question. So, hey, 17 years later, how's he coming on SNMP? And it's the same blank stare from not all, but most of the AV manufacturers, which is just frankly disheartening from my perspective, that we are now part and parcel. We're IT. We're no longer AV. We sit on the network, we rely on the network, and we get all the value and benefit and feature richness that comes with being connected to the network. We need to start acting like we belong on the network.
Yep.
Yes. Well said. Adding a NIC was an afterthought. Adding a NIC was like adding a COM port. I think that's, in my opinion, that's how the AV manufacturing industry looked at it. And again,
Yeah, all the
thank
cool
you
things
for
you're doing.
putting a network stack in the devices. We really appreciate it. It's great, right? That's a good start. But it was like, oh, we had COM ports before, and now we have this network interface, right? And it wasn't like the network came first for so much of the rest of this stuff that it was like, no, we're building something for networking. We're building something around networking by design, and that's, I think, still in some ways just not quite in the industry's DNA.
Well, guys, we've hit our hour. We've hit our hour, and I want to say, thank you for tuning in to everyone. I'm gonna give some last comments around here, but for those who don't know, Fred will be at InfoComm presenting. So if you want to talk more about this exciting subject, he is leading a session called Monitoring Meeting Rooms and the Journey Towards a Single Pane of Glass. So look him up, come sit in, come contribute. More than that, come be a part of the movement, because that's what I'm getting out of this, is really a bigger call to action for as many people as we can bring together to lobby the manufacturers and help move the needle on this, because it's much needed and it's going to bring our whole industry up completely. So with that, thank you from me. But Jim, Fred, last comments before we sign off?
Yeah, I'll go next to give Fred the last last line. I just want to say, Fred, thank you so much for being our first guest. This was an outstanding conversation, and InfoComm is exactly a month away, right? The 3-day classes start June 4. So I am just getting pumped. I love the idea of a call to action, and I love the idea that, like, as AV folks, we're kind of growing up. We're getting a little bit more sophisticated, and our asks of the manufacturers are following. I'm very excited for what InfoComm is going to bring, and I'm very excited for more of these conversations in the future.
Yeah, 100%. I'll just say, come to the session if you can. I'm not sure what the plans are for recording it or streaming it, but if you're going to be there, make sure you're at the session. Mostly what we're going to get into is, I won't rant this much, I promise. We'll try to get into some practical steps of how you actually get there, though I will certainly save some time for how we could have avoided this mess in the first place and what we can do about it. So I'll be looking out for arrows or grenades slung at me from the audience or the back of the room, but definitely going to get into how you might be able to actually do this. And of course, if you run into each other at InfoComm and you want to ask questions, great opportunity to pick my brain, and I can tell you pretty much explicitly how to do it, how to go build your own monitoring solution on top of what's there. So happy to share that information and spread the love while we try to fix this mess and make it better for everybody, because we're all depending on it. So.
Fred, thank you so much. Everybody, again, thanks for tuning in. This concludes our episode 13. We'll see you again next month, and if we're lucky enough, we might even have Fred back to keep talking about all the fun things we're constantly thinking about from an industry perspective. So thanks again. See you next month.
Thanks. Later on.
Justin and Chris, thank you so much. And remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you.
Nice job, Jim. That was well played.